If the webinar is on, I'm Anne-Catherine, co-founder of Nordic Laboratories and DNA Life. I'm just going to mute you, Wim. There. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight our philosophy, because we are working with functional medicine and lab tests that can enhance outcomes in functional medicine practices. We very much believe in people taking ownership of their health and taking responsibility, working with well-educated practitioners, and really supporting health optimization in their lives. So yeah, make sure everyone that you try and log on to your profile in either DNA Life or Nordic Labs, and try it out a little bit. The smart thing with our platform is that you can actually order a SIBO test, you can order a GI map and a Dutch test in one order for your patient, and the results will be uploaded in your report or in your profile, and you can share them there with your patients. And remember, we drop ship, so in these days where there is less getting together with our patients, yeah, everything can happen online, and we just ship as you wish. Even to the Cayman Islands. I had a question last week about that, and we have been shipping backwards and forwards from the Cayman Islands. So then I want to announce our next webinar, which is next Thursday, same time, same place, in my home office. And it's going to be with Dr. Miguel Damas, who's a very good friend and colleague of mine. He's a family doctor, and actually a second-generation functional medicine doctor. He's going to discuss functional medicine doctor's approach to the treatment of autoimmunity. So that's going to be really exciting as well. And he's going to show it's like a, yeah, the dance of functional medicine when you are thinking about treating your patients. So we're looking forward to that. Then right now I actually have a gap, and I'm gonna try and play a little bit with this and see if anyone is up for it. But if anyone out there has something on their heart that relates to functional medicine, laboratory tests, maybe some of the supplements that Nordic and DNA Life is offering, then please send an email to me. And you can just reply our mails that we are sending out. And yeah, I can look at it and we can see if we can work something out. I may even pay back in return for a SIBO test or a GI map or Dutch test. Let's try it out, see what people are up for. I will send out later, actually about an hour after we finish this, I will send out the invite for the next webinar, so you can sign up there. And of course, the recordings will be sent out tomorrow with Gary's slides, and also a link there to signing up for Miguel's webinar. So I think, yeah, that's enough about all these practical things. So Gary, I actually met you in New York, maybe 3 years ago. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It was at the what's it called, the
IHS.
IHS, exactly. And I had taken some time off from my booth, and I was walking a little bit around, and I met you, and I met this guy, and he was just talking SIBO all over the place. And yes, he was talking about don't collect with 6 tubes, collect with 10 tubes, and he was explaining me why. And like, you need to calibrate, you have to trust the lab that you're working with, and so on. And I just was like, whoa, this guy, I need to work with this guy. So that was when we embarked that journey.
I don't know if you can still hear me, Anne-Catherine. You froze up just a bit.
You, Gary.
There we go.
So, yeah, that's why we, why I got to think about this and inviting Gary home to you all, so you can learn from the master. So Gary, welcome. I will pass the stage on, as I call it, to you. And yeah, people feel free to ask questions on the side. I will try and answer as well as I can. I'm not the expert here. I'm just a humble dietitian with a master's in nutritional medicine who's been working for about 20 years with this. So, but this is not my specialty per se. This is your specialty.
Yes.
So, and then I'll pick up on some of the questions that I think will be good to bring up in the end. So,
great.
There you go.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. I know it's the end of your day. Good afternoon. I am 7 hours behind, so I'm just getting started on my day. But I want to thank you, Anne-Catherine, for inviting me. Thank you to Nordic Labs for having me spend a few moments with everyone. And as Anne-Catherine mentioned, questions are fantastic. So any questions that you have that we might be able to answer here or offline, we'll be happy to do so. We wanted to take some time and talk about breath testing, SIBO in particular, just because that tends to be the primary request that we have with regard to presentations, podcasts, etc. So as Anne-Catherine mentioned, I founded the lab just about 6 years ago. Have been in healthcare and diagnostics for about 25 years. And the reason I founded Aerodiagnostics was that we were dealing with SIBO as a family. And at that point, I was living just outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And I went to a local, very well-known hospital, and I saw how the actual collections were being done, how the prep was being suggested, and then the actual collections, and then the interpretations. And I just could not, even though it was a very good hospital, I couldn't trust the data, and it really bothered me. And then I started looking more and more into SIBO and food intolerances and seeing what the testing was like. So that was the reason to start this. And as Anne-Catherine mentioned, I'm very passionate about doing the testing accurately. And that's why we're calling this conversation accurately measuring the clinical impressions alongside of the breath test data that we provide you. The only diagnosis from my perspective can come from the clinician. The lab, if the lab is doing the right work the right way and working with the patient to be sure that the collections are done the right way, then the data that you receive should always match your clinical impressions, okay? And that's what we like to focus on. And you'll notice that we have kind of a secondary on the title here. It has to do with hydrogen sulfide. So we'll talk a lot more about that toward the end of the presentation, but essentially current testing is only available for hydrogen and methane gas. There is a component of bacteria, for whatever reason, in certain individuals that will ferment hydrogen sulfide gas, and I'm seeing it in somewhere around 1 to 4% of the SIBO patients that we test. And again, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but that's why we have that on there as well. It's a very popular topic nowadays, although I think it's presenting as though it's has a larger impact than what I tend to see in the data. But let's move forward. So just as a brief review, patients will present, and a lot of these, a lot of the patient symptoms that you see, the bloating, the cramping, diarrhea, and or constipation, they all can be obviously many different conditions, right? So the reason to test is to be sure that we are dealing with SIBO, or we're dealing with an intolerance, or it's neither, and you can move on. Many years ago, and it has gotten better recently, but years ago, many clinicians did not test. They didn't test because the testing wasn't very good. And we're going to talk about this as well. Labs were only testing hydrogen, and still to this day, in many of the countries that I know are represented here, a lion's share of the testing is handheld hydrogen-only devices, and you'll see how ineffective that can be. So clinicians, as they were getting these reports, they were looking at the results and they're saying, this does not match what I'm seeing from the clinical impressions of the patient. And they were right. And that's why the testing was not really held up to be something of a good tool for them to use. Now the accuracy, especially when you do things the right way, the accuracy is so good that we are able to align and further support you, not only in determining whether or not you're dealing with SIBO or an intolerance, but also if you're dealing with SIBO, you know, how the treatments did the treatment work? Did you eradicate the bacteria? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. As I had mentioned, many of the tests that are still out there are just hydrogen only, and you can see 35% of adults, the bacteria, when present, will yield methane gas. So you would get false negatives when you're only looking at a hydrogen only test. And then, as we all know, when you find methane on a hydrogen methane breath test, it's incredibly important to consider the treatment approach that you'll take, because you will treat differently a patient that has methane on a hydrogen methane breath test. And that comes from a 2010 Journal of Gastroenterology study that clearly showed that if your choice is to use antibiotics, using combination therapy will eradicate the bacteria 87% of the time versus 33% of the time on monotherapy. And the same has transitioned, even though there aren't studies to point to, with your herbal approaches. So oftentimes clinicians, if they're using an herbal approach, will add Alamed, you know, to address the methane. So it's important not only to confirm that you're dealing with SIBO in this case, but also whether or not you're dealing with methane. Accuracy. This is what Anne Catherine was referring to, my passion when I first started, and my story about seeing it firsthand about the inaccuracy. Everything starts with the preparation. So the patients are provided a breath collection kit. They can collect their breath in the comfort of their own homes, at work, wherever. It's a 3-hour breath collection. They take breath samples every 20 minutes for a SIBO test. For our intolerance test, we do every 30 minutes for 3 hours, so it's 7 test tubes. Prior to collecting their breath, they're asked to prep, and the prep is so incredibly important. And this is where many of the laboratories that do the testing or the offices that do it unfortunately get it wrong. There's a very specific preparation that we need to follow. And the reason for this is that it has been studied to give us reproducible results. So for 24 hours, there's a prep. The first 12 hours is a limited diet. In the limited diet, they can have any of these foods on the diet. They don't have to eat all of them, but they have to eat from this list. And it's chicken, fish, turkey, eggs, white rice, white bread. Again, they don't have to eat all those items, but just from that list. And are there other foods that possibly would work and would exit the system prior to the breath collection? Absolutely. There are highly absorbable foods and things that would work. They just haven't been studied. So what we'd like to do is be very strict with the prep diet, the 12 hours, limit them to those foods. I know that we have, you know, patients that are vegan and we have other dietary concerns. We can work with that somewhat, but the goal is that the food that's consumed as part of the first 12 hours is out of the GI tract by the time we're collecting breath. And why is that? How does this test work? Well, if you control for food, you have no food in the GI tract. If there is bacteria in the small intestine, if you take a breath sample, there should be no gas, because the bacteria alone isn't producing the gas until it's fermenting or eating something. So that's why we control for food by the strict prep diet and then the strict water only fast 12 hours after the prep diet. So the last 12 hours of the 24-hour prep, water only, typically overnight. So they'll eat the limited diet during the day. Overnight, they'll fast, water only, no brushing of teeth. We'll talk about that in a moment. No mints, no gums, nothing like that. And then they start collecting their breath. So if you have no food, and let's say you do have bacteria in your small intestine, when you consume the lactulose or glucose, which are the two substrates that are approved to use for a SIBO test, those substrates will go, you only choose one, of course, will go through the GI tract. When it finds bacteria, it'll ferment the bacteria. The bacteria will produce the gas, the hydrogen or methane gas, that diffuses through the blood and exits via the lung air. And that's how we capture it. So if you have a patient that doesn't follow the prep diet or doesn't follow the fast, food can be in the colon where we know we have bacteria. Bacteria is supposed to be in the colon. And if that's fermenting, when we're collecting breath and we think in the lab and you think as the clinician that the first 2 hours that we're looking for gas to see if we have bacteria in the small intestine, we could be getting gas from the colon because there's food there. That's why the prep is so incredibly important. I know I spent a lot of time on it, but I can tell you that's the #1 reason why you get test results that don't match your clinical impressions. So after the test, after the prep diet, they collect their breath over 3 hours, then we have a data set, and we're going to talk about that. But the most important thing is the prep. Then the second step in that is the actual equipment that we use, and we're going to talk about that. Before we move on, I just want to cover the tests that are available. So typically, we're getting SIBO breath tests, but there also are, intolerance tests that we do, the lactose, fructose, and sucrose. So we have that available. Let me move on here. There we go. Sorry about that. So the breath collection kit is the second step in the process. So the kit is incredibly important as well. Why is that? Well, we need to be sure that we're collecting true lung air, not room air or mouth air. And the way that we do that is by using this patented device by a manufacturer that pretty much is a family-owned business. The original grandfather was a PhD that worked with a clinician in Guatemala and came up with testing breath for detection of bacteria. And this device is like a vacutainer, like you use for blood draws, except that clearly it doesn't puncture the patient. It punctures the vacuum sealed test tubes that you see here. So that blue bag that you see attached to the mouthpiece, that is not collecting the sample. That's just meant for flow. If you actually look closely, if you see one of these in your practice, you'll see that there's actually a hole in that bag. It's designed that way. But what the patient does is they exhale through the mouthpiece. On the other side of the mouthpiece is where the vacuum sealed test tube, which has a rubber stopper, will push over a needle. And hold on a second. Something happened with the screen here. My apologies. 1 second. Well, let me keep talking until we can try to get this to go back. There we go. So what you're seeing there is the mouthpiece and the vacuum sealed test tube. The test tube is never opened up to room air. So as it punctures over the needle and the patient exhales, the breath from the air from the lungs goes through the mouth, through the mouthpiece, through the needle, and into the vacuum sealed test tube. Okay, that's why brushing of teeth does not matter, other than they can, some, toothpaste can, if they were brushed before the collection, can make it into the colon and give us false read. That's why we ask them not to brush teeth. Essentially, you get the test tube. Then when we measure it, we're going to measure carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide levels are found at constant rates in lung air and in trace amounts in non-lung air. So that's how we know we have a true lung air sample. Okay, so that's why the kit is important, and that's why the prep is important. So the instruments that we use are solid state sensor devices. These give us reproducible, reproducible results. Sorry, water. The studies that we have to support, and Catherine, can I take 1 second? Got to get 1 second.
No problem.
I'm gonna grab some water.
I can just say a few things on the side. Again, he was talking about Alimet, the garlic product, and for those of you who are perhaps not that much aware that in your practitioner profile, you're also able to order supplements. So when you log in, you can see there is a menu that says tests, and then there's one that says supplements. And under supplements, we have about 1,500 different supplements. So yeah, go ahead. It's a candy store for someone working with functional medicine. So, and if there's something you really need and can't find, reach out anyway. Anyway, Gary, over to you again.
Thank you for that. So sorry. Had to get a drink of water. I don't know why. Maybe the allergies here in Texas, not sure. Anyway, the studies, thank you for that pause. I appreciate that. So the studies are, I'm not going to go through these. You're going to see when you get this deck, there are several studies here. Many of them have to do with what we were saying that support the accuracy of hydrogen and methane breath testing. And when it's not accurate, when you're measuring only hydrogen, what can happen and how the accuracy is not good. So that's what you're seeing here. So glucose versus lactulose. I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on that, but what you'll hear when you listen to presentations or read some studies, you'll hear that some clinicians, you have to use glucose or you have to use lactulose. There are many opinions on this, and those that support glucose will say lactulose will give you a false negative. A false positive. Those that use lactulose will say that glucose will miss a distal infection. The fact is, if you look at the actual studies that looked at glucose and lactulose in hydrogen and methane breath testing, you'll see that both are highly accurate. And I don't want to go too far into that. We'll waste too much time. But anyone who has any questions, I can talk with you more about it. So why test? We talked about this. Why test? A lot of these symptoms look very similar to other conditions. So we need to know, as we discussed earlier, we need to know if we're dealing with SIBO, and if so, if we have methane, because we'll treat differently. So which test? When do I know when to test for SIBO or when to test for an intolerance? Well, the great news is it's pretty simple. SIBO, you will have chronic postprandial SIBO symptoms, and chronic as defined as any time of day, any day of week, any type of food. Why is that? If there's bacteria where it doesn't belong in the small intestine, it doesn't matter if it's Monday morning, Thursday afternoon, Sunday evening, doesn't matter if it's a hamburger, if it's a salad, if it's a steak. If there's bacteria where it doesn't belong and you feed it, it's going to ferment, and that fermentation process will yield hydrogen and/or methane gas. And that's why SIBO is the chronic symptoms every time that they eat. Intermittent symptoms would be more likely an intolerance or another issue. So typically what would happen is they would diary food intake with, with any symptoms that they are experiencing. If you suspect SIBO, one of the most important things is to suspect it, test to confirm it, treat, and then retest to confirm that you eradicated it. Many clinicians, and I understand that their funds are limited for patients and for most folks. The problem with not retesting is that it's like a weed in a root. If you pull the weed, the root is still there. And that's where we get a high level of recurrence. So we don't want to have a high level of recurrence. We don't want the patients coming back in a month or 2 months and starting the whole process all over again. That's why it's so important to test, confirm, and then treat, and then retest. I can't emphasize that enough. So here's the better part. Now we get to talk about breath test results, and interpretations. Okay, there are several interpretive approaches, and many clinicians, many SIBO thought leaders have their approach that they want to take. And if I could highlight it generally, there are 4 approaches. You have the gold standard, which was based off of the breath test in gastroenterology. The second edition was 1998. We'll talk about that. You have the Rome consensus that was done in 2009. Then you have this new North American consensus that was done in 2017. And then a general approach, which is a combination of many of these interpretive methods. So this is almost like the core training for hydrogen and methane breath testing, and you know, really understanding how it works, how to interpret. Essentially, think about with SIBO, if you're doing a 3-hour breath test, we're looking for gas within the first 2 hours. We can challenge the gas that comes toward the end of the first 2 hours, but generally speaking, if you've removed food, you take a breath sample, you have a nice low baseline indicating that the prep was done right, then you consume either lactulose or glucose. As that goes through the small intestine, it finds bacteria, and that bacteria yields the gas. If we find bacteria or parts per million of hydrogen or methane gas to a certain level, that would be indicative of a positive indication for SIBO. With intolerances, it's different. Still a 3-hour test, but we're not looking for gas early. We're looking for gas at the end. Why would that be? If we've removed all food, then we do a nice low baseline to ensure that prep was done right. Now we introduce what we feel that the patient is intolerant to, whether it be lactose from dairy, fructose from fruit sugars, or sucrose from table sugars. We're looking to see if the patient lacks the enzyme to break down that sugar, so that sugar makes it to the colon. So it makes it to the colon. We know there's bacteria in the colon. We get the rise at the end of the test, okay? I am going to show you an interesting example on the reports of when you have an intolerance test and you have gas early and gas late, and what that might tell us. But back to interpretations, the first approach is this tried and true, this almost a core training on how to interpret, how to do breath testing. The second one, as I mentioned, is the Rome consensus. So the Rome consensus is pretty much the gold standard from my perspective. This consensus was a year-long work, multifunctional clinicians, from dietitians to functional medicine docs to GIs to family practice to PhDs. They were all given assignments, and they all came back and had a really in-depth consensus meeting and came up with how to interpret. So with SIBO, what we're looking for is a rise of hydrogen, rise of methane, or rise of the combined. If you use lactulose, we're looking for a rise of hydrogen of 20 parts per million or more within the first 2 hours. With methane, 12 parts per million or more within the first 2 hours, and the combined 15. With glucose, we're looking for a rise of 12 parts per million on hydrogen, methane, or the combined. That's essentially at a very high level. That's how the Rome consensus, that's what was looked at. The new North American consensus that was done in 2017, I personally don't follow many aspects of it, but the good news is with the data that you're provided, you can use any of these interpretive methods if you want. The report that you receive will be there will be a finding on there based on Rome consensus and the hydrogen and methane breath testing guidance that you saw in the first two interpretive methods here. With the North American, essentially they're looking for a rise of 20 parts per million of hydrogen. They're looking at, the suggestion is that 10 parts per million or more of methane anywhere on the test would be indicative. And I don't think that they actually look at a combined value on that one, but don't hold me to that. So I don't generally follow this one. This was a study, not actually a study, it was a survey that was sent out to 17 clinical GI sites in North America. And it was several survey questions. They answered them, came back, and they correlated the data, and that's where the results came up on how to interpret. So that's the North American consensus. The last one, the last approach is a general approach. So the general approach is, I'm going to look at the gas data as long as we have the controls in place. Let's say we have a good baseline, which indicates the patient prepped correctly. We have good CO2 values, which says to us that we have true lung air. If we have gas in the small intestine, anywhere from 0 minutes up to 120 minutes, then that would give me the indication that there's bacteria there, because the human body does not produce hydrogen or methane gas. It's the byproduct of the fermentation of bacteria with a food source. So that's how we know gas is present, bacteria is present. So some clinicians are less concerned with how much parts per million of hydrogen or methane gas is there versus is it present? So presence or absence is the way that they look at it. So just to highlight the three again, you have your general approach, which is, do I have gas? Do I not? You have rises of gases, whether it be the Rome consensus or the North American. It's just differing levels that they're looking at with regard to methane. Okay, and you can find these online easily. They're free to download. So now I want to review some examples, and I think this is probably the most important part of our conversation today, because I think this is where it gets exciting. So thanks for allowing me to do the review. We're going to review every one of these, an example of these. So the first one is, this is 3 reports. These are 3 real world examples of a patient that tested. And if you can see here, this was June. If you look at your top right, this was June of 19. And what I'm pointing to here with the red arrow is the hydrogen gas column, ppm H2. I know it's a bit difficult to see. I tried to blow it up. The next column to its right is ppm CH4, so that's parts per million of methane gas. And what you're seeing here is you have a little bit of an elevated baseline because you see the 16 of hydrogen at test tube 1. So the one thing that I would do is always confirm that the prep was done correctly. It's not uncommon to have an elevated baseline. Perman in 1975, akin that to glycoproteins in the intestinal wall. So whenever you have an elevated baseline, you just want to confirm with the patient that they did the diet and they did the fast. And then the second thing I do is look over to the far right, the FCO2 column, and that is, if there are numbers in those cells, that means it's true lung air. There's occasion when someone will collect incorrectly. They'll maybe, when they're giving their sample, they'll inhale deeply and exhale forcefully, or they'll puff, or they'll insert the tube and then bring it up to the mouth. And that's why we do that CO2 test to be sure it's true lung air. If you were to inhale deeply and exhale forcefully, you might be putting room air into the tube. So in that FCO2 column, we'll see too high, TOOHIGH. And so that'll tell us it's an invalid sample. We can have an invalid sample here or there, but we want to see a good data set. We can always make a call on a test, and if a test is positive, no numbers will make a test negative. So keep that in mind. But back to this example, this is the first one. This is from June of 19. And where you're seeing the gas is toward the distal end. You see it starts at around 60 minutes and we look towards 60 and 120 minutes. So this was positive. This was positive starting at 60 minutes and then 80 minutes and then 100 minutes and 120 minutes. So this is just, if this were June of 2019, this result would have went back and said, okay, positive for hydrogen, positive for methane, as you can see on the left, and positive on the combined. Nothing new to report here. But now you look at the second one, same patient. And here you're looking at, I have to move this over so I can see the date. This is now September. So now we have September, and we're positive again here toward the distal end. So oftentimes, the clinician might evaluate between the June and September. What did I use? Maybe I have a non-responder, possibly, right? Or the patient wasn't compliant, or you have a stubborn situation with SIBO, or if you're using antibiotics, maybe only Xifaxan was used and not the combination therapy. That's why the methane wasn't addressed. You see the ppm CH4 is still there, with that 15 and 19. So it could have been those, or if they were using herbals, they didn't potentially use Alamed. So maybe that's the case. Okay, maybe that's the case. But what if it's not? What if they did everything right? The patient was compliant, completely treating, and you still have it here. Now look at the third test that's in October. Again, same thing. There was a little bit of improvement with the methane coming down. When methane comes down, that's good. When methane goes up, that's not good. So coming down, you see, but we still have it at the distal end. So this is where you would want to consider, why is there that population of gas toward the distal end of the small intestine? Is it because the patient potentially has a compromised ileocecal valve? And why would we say that? Well, where there's the gas is where the bacteria is. The gas is at the distal end. So this would be a perfect time after the series of 2 or 3 tests where you have distal gas to ask your patient, do they recall prior to symptom onset, was there a post-infectious situation? Did they have food poisoning? If they don't recall, and they don't always do, but let's say they didn't recall food poisoning, then you can ask if there was any kind of trauma to the lower abdomen. Was there, an issue? And it doesn't have to be an accident. It could have been a surgery. It could have been a colonic. It could have been anything. But when we see these distal positives, I've just shown you 3 results from the same patient, all with distal positive. If you zero in on a traumatic event, or if you just want to, take caution because you'll keep treating, you'll keep getting the same result, especially if they're telling you that they're feeling better on treatment and then they retest and this is what they find, you might want to send them for a visceral massage of the ileocecal valve. And we have seen where post-treatment and post-visceral therapy that we've resolved the SIBO condition. Okay, so that's that first example. The next one is 2 tests showing the reduction of methane. So you see where the red arrow is pointing to the CH4, the methane column. You see how it was positive mainly here with methane when it starts to go to the 15, the 19, and the 23. Well, they treat, let's say they use combination antibiotics or herbals with Alamed, and now the follow-up test, see how the methane goes down. When you break up a methane molecule, CH4 molecule, you sometimes free up hydrogen. So it's not surprising sometimes, even with good progress, methane comes down, hydrogen might come up. As long as methane is going down, that's good progress. Continue to treat, and before you know it, you'll eradicate the hydrogen as well, producing bacteria. One point on this one, if you look at the H2 column, you see how it's all elevated all throughout the test. Whenever, again, as I mentioned earlier, whenever you have an elevated baseline, you want to check PrEP just to be sure. And that is not uncommon to have elevated and sustained levels of gas. That also may be an indication of slow migrating motor complex. So this would be a patient that many clinicians might choose to treat with a prokinetic as well. So this one, so here is a fructose positive. This is what I was mentioning earlier. I love this example. So you have a patient that presents, they say, every time I have fruit, I don't feel well. So you suspect fructose intolerance. So you send the patient to do the fructose breath test, comes back positive. And if you recall what I said earlier, how does an intolerance test work? You prep the same way, you do a baseline breath sample, then you introduce what you think you're intolerant to, in this case, fructose. We want to see if there's gas at the end of the test. Why? Did that fructose make it to the colon? Because if you're not fructose intolerant, you or I, and we eat fruit, our bodies will break that down. We'll have the enzymes to break that down, so the fructose will not get to the colon. So because you're seeing that the bottom red arrow is pointing to gas toward the end of the test, that's your indication that the person lacked the ability to break down fructose. Now, that said, look at the top red arrow. So now we're seeing an elevated baseline that goes up in test tube 2, and then over time starts to come down and then raises back up again. This is a classic for the potential for SIBO in this patient also. That's what the elevated baseline comes from. You should still confirm that PrEP was done correctly, but whenever you have an elevated baseline that goes up in test tubes 2 and or 3, starts to come down, you want to check to see if you're dealing with SIBO as well. So you'll go back to the patient and mention, all right, we have confirmed that you have fructose intolerance. You knew that by eating fruit. Tell me about other foods that you eat. How do you feel after them? And it's likely, in this case, you're going to find that they have postprandial symptoms. And the symptoms, by the way, for SIBO don't have to be just gut symptoms. They don't have to be just bloating, cramping, nausea. It can be joint pain, restless leg syndrome, rosacea, or other skin issues. The #1 user of my test is a rheumatology office that screens all of their patients for SIBO, and there's a 60% of their patients presenting end up having SIBO, and that's primarily joint pain. So keep that in mind as well. The verbiage at the bottom of this report underneath the tables, that's what you'll find on the bottom of the report. And essentially that's the science that describes what I just said to you about the elevated baseline and then the further to the gas at the end of the test. So this will be highlighted. It'll be footnoted. Do you see where it says fructose intolerance is suspected? There are 2 footnotes there. That footnote number 4 is what I have highlighted, and that's alerting you as the clinician that you might suspect SIBO. You might want to test for SIBO. Okay, that's a great example. I love that example. And then here's the elevated and sustained levels of gas with a negative result. So if you look at the left table, we have bacterial overgrowth is not suspected, but then there are 2 footnotes again, right? So the footnotes are at the bottom of the report, and essentially what the footnotes are saying is if you look above that, it might be a little difficult to see, but if you see under the expected column on the table on the left, under the expected column, you can see that the expected for methane is bolded and has a footnote. The footnote of number 2 on this report is essentially saying that if you look at the table on the right, and if you look at the CH4 column, you're seeing if you find 3 parts per million of methane anywhere on this test between test tubes 1 and 7, so in the small intestine, if you have 3 or more, not a rise of 3, but if you have 3 or more parts per million, and if the patient is dealing with constipation, then it would be positive. So in the laboratory, we don't know if your patient is dealing with constipation, and they don't have to be constipated at the time of the test. They could be dealing with constipation, so they're treating themselves or you're treating them, and that would be a consideration that your patient is dealing with constipation. So if you have 3 or more, and in this case, again, if you look at the table on the right under the CH4 column, every single specimen between test tubes 1 and 7 has 3 or more in it. If you only had 1, it would be enough. That would be considered positive, and that's based off work from Cedars-Sinai Hospital, specifically the noted SIBO thought leader Mark Pimentel. So always keep in mind, with a lactulose SIBO breath test, did I have a rise of 12 parts per million or more? In this case, we did not have a rise. The rise was only 7, and I know that could be slightly confusing when you look at this because you're seeing the patient result as 7, but you're looking over here and you're saying, I see more than 12. Remember, the first threshold to evaluate methane or any of the gases is the rise of gas. So the largest rise that occurred between test tubes 1 and 7 was 7 parts per million. That was the largest rise, and that came from test tube 5, which was 10, and test tube 7, which is 17. So that's where the rise of 7 came in. So it was not positive for a rise. However, there's a footnote due to the fact that there's more than 3 parts per million of methane. So if your patient is dealing with constipation, it's positive. But then if you confirm prep, that the prep was done correctly, the other footnote on this report is saying that you have elevated and sustained levels of gas. Elevated and sustained levels of gas are certainly an indication of a positive as long as prep was followed. And this, again, as I mentioned earlier, would be a good, not only the approach that would be used is either combination antibiotics or herbals with Alamid, but also a prokinetic would often be employed to address the slow migrating motor complex, okay? All right, and then, so I love this example as well. This is a lactulose breath test. And what you're seeing where the red arrow is really no gas. There's 1s and 2s of hydrogen and 0s of methane. So the first question you have to ask is, why would that be? Lactulose, if lactulose is used, if it's negative, you would see test tubes 1 through 7 looking like they do, all low numbers. But when that lactulose, which is not broken down, enters the colon, as we've talked about, clearly the colon has bacteria, even a negative test with lactulose would have a rise at the end. Glucose would not, but lactulose would. So when you see a flat result like this, you ask 9 questions of yourself and the patient, and those 9 are right here. The number 1 reason for a no rise at the end of a lactulose test would be that the patient didn't drink the lactulose. Don't be too surprised. It happens all the time. We'll get specimens back in the laboratory and the substrate comes back with it. SIBO patients have brain fog. It's not uncommon to have that happen. Also, the lactulose that your patient receives is it's a syrup. It's in a small cup. Some patients don't read the instructions correctly. They just open the syrup and they drink the syrup. They don't mix it with water. So did they drink it? Did they mix it with water? Because then it get through the entire GI tract. If they did, then you can move on. Did they have a recent colonic? We're looking for reasons that maybe there isn't bacteria in this patient's, large intestine. If they had a recent colonic, that would explain it. Did they have really heavy diarrhea? Was there flushing of the large intestine? That would explain why we didn't have it. Were they on heavy doses of laxatives prior to the time of the test? Did they have a virus or something that may have, again, resulted in some sort of flushing or killing off of the bacteria? I'm going to save the true flatline for just a second. That's with regard to hydrogen sulfide. The other two reasons that were added on later were elemental diet will sometimes have that effect on colonic bacteria as well. I had to add this one, believe it or not. Does the patient have a colon? Because there are patients that don't have colons, as we know, and that's why we would get a flat, no rise at the end of their test. The 1/3 from the bottom here, the true flat line, we're going to talk a little bit more about hydrogen sulfide, but let's say you went through all of these questions. They drank it with water. You don't sense any flushing effects of the bowel. Then potentially we have a patient that has chronic postprandial SIBO symptoms. Remember, chronic as defined as any time of day, day of week type of food, no issues with the colon. Then why do we have a flat result? Because 1 to 2 or 3% of your patients, the bacteria in their body will produce hydrogen sulfide gas. And there's no devices on the market that actually measure hydrogen sulfide. The manufacturers have the device to do it. They have the sensors to do it. The problem is we don't have the studies to tell us what's normal and what's not. So that's being done real time right now by several manufacturers. I suspect within the next year or two, we'll probably have a device, and as soon as there's one available, we'll certainly have it at the laboratory. Okay, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into hydrogen sulfide in a moment. Let's keep going. So here's another SIBO breath test, and you see the red arrow right at test tube 7. It's positive. If you look over to the left, it says bacterial overgrowth is suspected. Why highlight this one? Well, as you can see, if you look at the table on the right above where the red arrow is, you have all low numbers. And then right at 120 minutes on hydrogen, you go from 9 to 27, on methane 4 to 7. Is this a true distal positive, or is this the lactulose going into the colon? Okay, so I refer to these as distal positives. Whenever you have a distal positive, you definitely want to ask yourself, was I ruling out SIBO, or do I suspect SIBO based on, again, chronic postprandial SIBO symptoms? Why? Lactulose can increase motility in some patients, and because it's a laxative. So this could be the lactulose going into the colon. This could be what you would refer to potentially as a false positive. It's really an interpretation, and it's not false if you read it based on if there's presence of chronic postprandial symptoms. If there aren't, if they are intermittent symptoms or there weren't, you were just ruling it out, I would not favor a positive with this result. But the line has to be drawn somewhere, and we found it's better to draw it at 120 minutes than at 90. The North American consensus will tell clinicians to only look at 90 minutes, and that would alleviate these types of situations. The problem with that, the problem with cutting it off at 90 minutes is that you do have true distal positives. So if you have a distal positive and you cut it off at 90 minutes, you could miss that. And that's why I like looking at a full 120 minutes. We call it positive or negative based on that, but we call it suspected, because when you have a situation like this, you want to challenge it. You want to ask yourself and ask the patient, do we truly have the chronic symptoms? If not, I would not favor a positive. However, many times you do get distal positives, going back to the first example of the ileocecal valve. So most patients are either going to get bacteria in their small intestine post-infectious because of a food poisoning event. If not that, then the bacteria is growing up from the colon. That's why these distal positives are so important. Okay. And then, so here's one where there's gas. This is what I was talking about earlier. So see where the red arrow is? You see all that gas, the 71, the 30, the 32, 22, 15, and then even the methane has gas. So this to me looks like this could be bad preparation because you have a high baseline that comes down. So the first thing you always want to do, as I had mentioned a couple of times with elevated baselines, always confirm prep. Did the patient follow the limited diet? Did they fast? Most importantly, did they fast for 12 hours, water only? Did they brush teeth? Did they have any mince gums? Did they make a mistake and take a bite or a sip of something? If they say, no, I absolutely fasted everything there, then this is gas presence. This is where, if you recall, before we started going through the examples, I said there are certain interpretive approaches. Well, one of the approaches is, do I have gas? Yes, there's gas here. Gas comes from bacteria fermenting only. The human body doesn't make it. So as long as you confirm prep, some clinicians would treat a patient because this is the confirmation that there's bacteria present. And that's why it's important to point these out. They're not always bad prep. There are very good reasons for having elevated baselines, but if you have chronic postprandial symptoms, the patient followed the prep and especially the fast, this is bacteria that's producing the gas. Okay, and then the other highlight on this, obviously, as you're seeing it on the left, is we're highlighting again the 3 parts per million. We don't know in the lab if the patient is dealing with constipation, but in this case, if you look at test tubes 1 through 7 on the CH4 column on the right, you're seeing more than 3 parts per million in every single test tube there. So that's a good one to ask yourself and the patient if you're dealing with constipation, okay? And okay, so we're gonna finish up here with that last part, the hydrogen sulfide gas. So again, 1 to 4 or 5% of your patients, as we're seeing, I've reviewed about 50,000 of these, we're seeing this hydrogen sulfide gas potential. And there's no way to measure it, as I mentioned, but a telltale sign would be a patient gets a flatline breath test. And that means very low gases, whether it's glucose or lactose, just very low gases throughout the test, yet they have chronic symptoms. That's when you want to ask these questions of the patient. You want to ask, and now there's a lot here, right? You're going to have these slides. I'm going to go to the next slide, but that's the real in-depth way to look at this. There's SIBO symptoms, there's other published symptoms, then there's the clinical data, and this comes from Dr. Seebecker's work. But more simply, it's this. Let's say you have a patient that has chronic postprandial symptoms, and they either have a flat hydrogen and methane breath test, or they don't have a flat one. You can always still ask these questions because that'll matter with the way that you approach treatment. Do they have body pain, almost like a fibromyalgia type of report? Do they have bladder irritation, burning urination, or any kind of bladder issues? Tingling of the hands or feet? Sulfur, issues with sulfur supplements, etc., that kind of thing. And then the gas, of course. So the gas that they produce will have that rotten egg odor to it. If you get positives on 1 or more of these, then you might consider that the patient is dealing with bacteria that's producing hydrogen sulfide gas. And with those, Dr. Seebecker, this is what she does and what some of the SIBO thought leaders do, to address the hydrogen sulfide. Essentially, it's the addition of bismuth, okay? And it's compounded. She uses it, as you can see, about 2,000 milligrams a day, which is usually done, 500 QID, and she does that 2 to 4 weeks. And that's her approach to treating hydrogen sulfide. So with that, I'm not going to go through these. Obviously, there's all the hydrogen sulfide information here. There are many reference slides that are attached. Okay. So, and Catherine, I think we had some questions on there. I saw some pop up, and I'm happy to go back to any of these reports if there were questions on those reports or interpretation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. Yeah, we all had to keep the ears straight out to get it all in there, but luckily there's a recording. So yeah, a few questions did pop up, and I have to watch the screen to see if more comes up. One was about, actually there's been a couple on H. pylori. Like, would H. pylori produce methane and hydrogen too? How could you read, can you read that from a report?
The hydrogen and methane breath test that you're seeing for SIBO or intolerances will not tell you presence or absence of H. pylori. The hydrogen and methane breath test is just purely measuring hydrogen gas and or methane gas, and that is the indication that there's bacteria producing results. It's not going to tell you which bacteria, although we know methane, it comes from archaea, and that's what's so good about the breath test. It's so binary. It's so absence or presence. The fact is, with SIBO, we're looking for gas within the first 2 hours. You should not have that unless you have bacteria in your small intestine. It doesn't matter which type of bacteria. H. pylori will not affect that one way or the other. If you have that gas within the first 2 hours, you have presence of bacteria proof. And as long as you have chronic postprandial symptoms, the patients will respond to therapy. With intolerances, again, we're looking for gas late. And again, that has nothing to do with H. pylori. This has to do with, does the patient lack the enzymes, or with regard to fructose, the carrier enzymes that allow it to make it to the colon. Does that answer the question?
It certainly does. To me, it does. And it also opens up that, like I very often order both a SIBO test and a stool test, like a GI map, to see, because GI map has the Helicobacter pylori in it. So if that's, and a lot of other practitioners do the same, and that's the smart thing with our system, that you can order tests from different labs in one order for the patient. So
and Catherine, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because this question comes up a lot. Well, I have the stool test, and that will tell me if I'm dealing with SIBO. It's not. Stool tests are very good and very useful, but not for SIBO. They're about 8% effective on picking up SIBO, but it's always nice to see it in addition to the breath test, but highly recommend that they're very complementary together.
Thank you. So, and another one asked if you could touch the intestinal motility, fast, slow, migrating motor complex a little bit again.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the question. I know that I race through these a lot because I think the Q&A is actually better in many respects to get down into the real questions that folks have. So with intestinal motility, it can vary, right? You can have slow motility, you can have fast motility. You don't know from patient to patient. That's why there's this whole tug of war in those and how to interpret these. Do you look at the first 2 hours or do you look at the first 90 minutes? No one would doubt that at 90 minutes, you're going to have more true positives if you look at this from a pure statistical perspective. But that's what I was saying. If you don't look past 90 minutes and up to 120, you will get some false negatives because you're going to have those that have the bacteria that have slower motility or that have the bacteria more distally, and that you're just not in the colon in every patient at 90 minutes. So motility really matters. That's why it's prudent to look at the first 2 hours and really make that decision after you do that. And here was the one I think that pointed that out. Let's see if I can find it here really quickly. Right there. Well, no, that's not it. Anyway, it's the distal positives that are important. So motility will change from patient to patient. If we know that by looking at the full first 2 hours that will be helpful in us making a determination of whether or not we're dealing with SIBO. With regard to elevated and sustained levels of gas, so that is an indication. That's really where the question came from. Here's an example. If you look at the table on the right, not where the red arrow is, but immediately to its left, the H2 column, you see how it's all elevated? It's all above 10, starting right from test tube 1 all the way through the entire test. This, by some clinicians, is an indication of slow migrating motor complex. Years ago, they referred to it as gastroparesis and acetylcholine. Essentially, this is showing slow migrating motor complex. Potentially, this is a type of patient, after you confirm the prep was followed correctly, that you would entertain a prokinetic of some sort. Some clinicians use low-dose erythromycin. A noted SIBO thought leader in Italy uses low-dose naltrexone. And then you have motility agents, herbal motility agents that work very well also. Did that answer that question?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of questions has come up on how you treat it and what different supplements and so on. And that was in the slide, one of the last slides. There were some mentioning of different antimicrobial products. Just be aware for those who live in Europe and who sees patients in Europe, because there's also patients in America who sees patients in Europe and so on, that there are some of the one from the Mullins protocol, some of those products we can't get here because it's a combination product of different herbs, and then there's some European laws about how many can be combined in one go and so on. But here is a slide, and remember the slides will be shared with you, so this can give you some inspiration as what to work with. But some supplements can kind of substitute these combination products where you just go in and use like grapefruit seed extract, caprylic acid, the allicin by itself. So there is a list of many different antimicrobial products. And can I just ask you something? And now I'm bypassing some of the questions. But very often the product Atrantil is also mentioned for methane positive reports. Can you comment on that, please?
I can. I have many clinicians that use Atrantil, and they have success with it. I would not say it's a majority of the clinicians that I work with, but certainly a majority of the functional medicine clinicians that I work with will use Atrantil.
Okay.
And
so
I think the big thing with herbals is that, or the most important thing with herbals is that if you have methane on the test, meaning it's positive for methane or you're seeing a presence of methane, you want to address that with Alamed, the whole garlic. That's the most important reminder with regard to this. And that doesn't come from me. It comes from the SIBO thought leaders like you're seeing here.
So I can comment a little bit on the different questions at the end here. So the Mullins protocol, where I find it would be a publication where they're looking to compare a herbal treatment to a standard treatment, which is a prescriptive treatment, to see the effectiveness and compare those two, where it's more or less the same. Actually, the herbs have a slight benefit, I would say, if you want to give it the benefit of the doubt. So that's where I can see if I can just find it and share it with you. If I am going to travel a little bit tomorrow, so but I'll see if I can find it's an open source article. So yeah, so that's that. With that publication, there's nothing really holding you back for not trying to use herbs first, I would say, and they may work milder, and they may work on other things and things that we haven't necessarily measured already in the gut. So yeah, but I'll see if I can find that article and share with you. Another question came up, like how old, in regards to children, how far down do you go age-wise? And
so the manufacturer of the equipment actually has a device for infants. However, we've never used that. We have had patients as young as 3 and 4 years old. It really depends on the patient. Can the patient provide the breath sample, and can they do the preparation? It's very difficult, as you can imagine, for children to do a 24-hour prep, especially 12 hours fasting. And then at the tail end of the 24 hours, you're 3 hours awake doing breath samples without having any food, just water. So if the patient can do the prep, and if they can use the device, which is essentially just exhaling through the device, then you can, we have seen it as low as 3 and 4, but generally speaking, I start to see patients at 10, 12, that's where we're starting to see those.
So I think we're getting to the end. So the last 2 things I'm going to read up to you, and then we can discuss that, and then we'll shut down for questions, because then people have to move on to their things. So Anyway, one is asking about like dosage on the Alimed. Do you have a comment on that, or would they just have to try a little bit and see how?
I think you buy it as a product, and I'm not sure because we don't really make commentary on treatments other than I pass along information that from the SIBO thought leaders. So I think that if you do a web search on that, I think they'll tell you. Another resource for dosing and for treatment options is the website SIBOinfo.com. So it's SIBOinfo.com. That's what you're seeing up in the top left of the slide. If it's a very simple website, but if you go along the top, there's a treatment tab, treatment, and you go down to herbal antimicrobials, antibiotics, elemental diet, etc., and they have all of the information there for you.
Excellent. So on to Karina Athwell's question. I have a few clients with high methane and diarrhea who are non-responders with high baseline that remains high or increases. Would you consider migrating motor complex issues here and or a ileocecal valve issue?
So a couple of things. Anytime you have an elevated baseline, please confirm that the prep was done correctly, number one, because that's the number one reason for an elevated baseline. If the prep was done right, the 24 hours to 12 hours of the diet, the 12 hours of the fast, water only, no brushing of teeth, then I would consider when you have it elevated and it stays elevated throughout the entire test, that looks like a positive and it looks like slow migrating motor complex. With regard to ileocecal valve, it's from that description, you can't necessarily discern that, right? If there's gas at the distal end, it always could be because of that. It would be good to just question the patient about the initial onset of symptoms, when it occurred, what happened around that time. Do they recall a food poisoning event? If not, do they recall any kind of trauma? Again, doesn't have to be an accident. It could be that they're a soccer player. It could be that they're a young parent and they got kicked, by the child. It could be that they do martial arts. Anything that you think might have disturbed the ileocecal valve. And then oftentimes those that do visceral massage apparently can tell if you have a disruption with the valve. It's interesting to me. I haven't had any experience with it, but other than seeing the results here after, breath test result after, but it's certainly a consideration, but that comes from the questioning and your clinical impressions of initial onset of symptoms.
And that just allows for one more question that came earlier that I didn't touch, and that was so I'm going to rephrase the question a little bit in regards to appendectomy, I think it's called.
Appendectomy, yeah.
Do you see any patterns there?
No, not with that, but the question we normally get, so not with an appendectomy necessarily, but I wonder if the real question is, and tell me if it is or if it isn't, if they've had like a Whipple or a shortening, like a resection of the small intestine. Would that be, you think that's around the same question?
No, it was more specifically like, would that be gas at 120 minutes if a patient had had an appendectomy? No,
not necessarily based on that. If you have gas at that 120-minute mark, it's either the lactulose going into the colon, or it's a true positive and it just happens to be really distal. It's at the end of the 23 roughly foot, small intestine is where the bacteria is residing.
Excellent. People are beginning to write thank you and great information and so on. So yeah, I will thank you, and yeah, thank you very much for the preparation and your time, and yeah, and so again,